Okay, why don't we start? Last time I began talking about perhaps one of the most interesting and most problematic ideas in social cognition, which is the self. Everybody knows we have a self, something like a self, but defining the self has been problematic for psychologists for a long time. One way to deal with this issue is just to cut right to it, like it's a Gordian's knot or something, and simply say that the self viewed cognitively is one's mental representation of oneself. I have a representation of myself the same way I have a representation of anybody else I know. And last time we talked about two takes on this idea of the self as a mental representation of the self. We talked about what it might mean to talk seriously about a self-concept, viewing the self as a kind of conceptual structure, and then we talked about what it would mean to take seriously the idea of a self-image, that is, of a perception-based representation of the self. What I want to do today is to turn to a third way of thinking about the self cognitively, and that is to say the self as a memory, or perhaps better put, as a memory structure. And it's pretty clear that we do have the self as a mental representation has to be stored somehow in memory. Right? It's just like our knowledge about anybody else, and that this memory structure that represents the self is going to hold in it a mix of episodic and semantic information. It's going to have a record of my specific experiences and actions over the course of my life, and it's also going to have some indication of what my general characteristics are, who I'm related to, what I look like, and all of that kind of business. And for the moment, actually for the entire lecture, we're going to assume that this is represented in some kind of verbal format, some kind of propositional format, though you'll see in a second. That's not strictly true. Just makes it easier to talk about it if we stick with the propositional format. Okay. Now, this idea that the self is somehow associated with memory is a very old idea. It comes to us really from John Locke, if not earlier than that, who argued that as far as consciousness can be extended backwards to any past action or thought, so far reaches the identity of that person. That is to say, your identity extends to those things that you can remember. And it's this property of memory that allows us to say that I'm the same person I'm the same person now as I was when I graduated from college, as I was when I got married, or whatever. And it's memory that allows us to experience ourselves as one person with one identity over time. Now, this is a philosophical issue that has encountered some objections from time to time. David Hume argued against the idea that there's any kind of enduring self. Hume was kind of an arch empiricist, and he wasn't happy about the idea that there's some kind of self there that serves as some kind of enduring structure. But even he said the impression that we have a self, the illusion, if you will, that we have a self, is something that's created by identity. So even Hume, who denied that we had a self, really thought that there was a close relationship between the experience of self and the faculty of memory. And I won't talk about Thomas Reid. Reid argued that it couldn't be based just on identity, because you could have an identity, you could be the same person even if you didn't, the same person who did certain things, even if you didn't remember doing those things. But what Reid misses about this is that selfhood is a subjective construct, right? Yes, it's true that the person who did B, if the person who did A also did B, then that's the same person. And if the person who did C also did B, yes, then the person who did C is the same person as the person who did Act A. But that's not the point. What Locke and even Hume wanted to argue was that it's a subjective experience of memory that lays the foundation for selfhood. And without memory, there's no self, even in illusion. Okay, so this Hume and Locke position reminds us that we're talking about conscious recollections here. I don't want to talk about unconscious memories in the self. That's for another course. I'm happy to do that. I just don't want to deal with it right now. So now let's think about the self as some kind of structure in memory. And remember from the lectures on person memory kind of what these things look like. Here's our memory for James Bartlett, who's kind and thoughtless and rescued the kitten and caused the accident and looked like that. Now let's turn this inside out and say, what is James Bartlett's representation of himself looks like? And just as a kind of simple matter, it looks kind of like this. This is me. I'm kind and I'm thoughtless and I rescued a kitten and I caused the accident and I look like that and my name is James Bartlett. This is a kind of rudimentary way of thinking about James Bartlett's self as a memory structure. It's got semantic information about himself. It's got episodic information about himself. It's got a person identity node, just like in the Bruce and Young model. It's got the name attached to it, and it's also got this nonverbal analog perception-based information. So we can begin to think about the self as a memory structure in just this way. Okay, so now let's just review some material from the person memory lectures. Remember, one thing we want to do is to talk about the relationship between episodic and semantic knowledge about a person. That same problem comes up when we talk about episodic and semantic knowledge about ourselves. And you'll remember that basically there are three ways of thinking about this. One is the independent representation format, so that you've got semantic knowledge about oneself, that he's a neurotic and extroverted, and episodic information about oneself represented independently of each other. Then you've got this hierarchical notion where you've got a node representing the self, fanning out to nodes representing semantic information about the self, connected to nodes representing specific events and experiences that exemplify those pieces of semantic knowledge. And then finally, we've got this computational one where all that there is in the self is episodic information. And when you're asked to make a semantic judgment, are you neurotic, are you extroverted, whatever, what you do is you retrieve episodic information and then make some kind of computation about where you stand on these traits. Now, so the question is, which of these is the best representation for the memory-based representation of the self? We already have a hint from this because we know how this kind of information is organized with respect to memory for other people, and that is this independence format where semantic and episodic information are represented independently of each other. So now what we want to do is to say, let's just check. Okay, the hypothesis is that knowledge about the self is represented in exactly the same way. Let's check. And one of the ways we do this is by going back to our old friend, the priming paradigm. Stan Klein and his associates did this, asked subjects, remember the mother experiment, presented subjects with a series of trait adjectives, and then asked them whether that describes themselves, that trait describes themselves, asked them to recall an autobiographical memory in which they displayed that trait, or simply to define the term. And again, we're looking at priming. If episodic and semantic knowledge about the self is organized hierarchically, we'd expect an autobiographical task to prime a semantic task, and vice versa, because you have to get through the one in order to get to the other. Let's make this very simple. So we've got a couple of control conditions: repetition priming, a defined task followed by a defined task, a recall task followed by a recall task, a described task followed by a described task. Then we've got opportunities for semantic priming, a recall task followed by a described task, or a described task followed by a recall task, and then there are a bunch of control conditions. Not a very complicated experiment, not a very complicated set of results. What you can see here is that the same task will prime itself if you're if the priming task is to describe oneself, you've got reduced response latency if the next task is also to describe yourself. If your priming task is to recall an autobiographical memory, that primes the next trial where you have to recall an autobiographical memory. And if you have to define the term, that primes the next time you have to define the term. But there's no priming across categories. Performing an autobiographical memory task doesn't prime performance on a semantic memory task, nor vice versa, which again counts as evidence that autobiographical, episodic, and semantic knowledge about oneself, they're represented independently of each other. There's no priming across knowledge categories. So far, the self really does look like just another person that's represented in memory. The exact same format that we use to describe how person memory for other people is represented, can be used to describe how memory for ourselves is represented. Okay, so now let's start looking at this now. That can't be all there is to autobiographical memory. In fact, that can't be all that there is to person memory, but that's another story. Because when we talk about ourselves, what we're really doing is telling stories about ourselves. Okay, we're not just retrieving little pieces of information. You go to a party, you meet somebody new. He says, "So how'd you get to Berkeley?" You don't simply say, "Well, I took the bus from San Francisco," or whatever. You tell them a story about high school and all those kinds of things. Our self-concept is embedded in a story about ourselves, a story that we tell to ourselves, and a story that we tell to other people. So what we want to do is start looking at how our individual autobiographical memories are woven into a coherent story about the self. Okay. Now this is actually a fairly old idea. Roger Schenck, who's an artificial intelligence specialist, the late Robert Abelson, who's a famous social psychologist, argued that all of our knowledge is based around stories. That your knowledge about tools, your knowledge about physics, your knowledge about everyday life, and your knowledge about yourself, because they're all constructed around past experiences. I don't know whether that's true or not, but the radical claim that all knowledge is constructed as stories is something that's interesting to talk about. But they did have some interesting things to say about story memory and its relevance to both personal and social memory, because they argued that these old stories that we have in our heads constitute what they call the remembered self. Okay, self is story, and that when we have story memories that are shared within a social group, your fraternity members, your family members, your club members, or whatever, that this shared patterns of stories where other people know the same story about you that you know about yourself, that is how we can define a particular context-specific self. Very interesting idea. But now let's take this idea that there's more to autobiographical memory than just a bunch of nodes in memory representing specific experiences, and try to understand how they're organized. Okay. This is an especially interesting topic, I think, for those of us who have interdisciplinary interests, because by far the most popular literary genre in Western culture today, and has been for about 20 years now, is the memoir. People write novels, some people read them. People write short stories, some people read them. But when somebody publishes a memoir, everybody goes out and buys them. They appear on Oprah. They're interviewed on the Today Show and Good Morning America and all of that. It's really quite a remarkable turn in literary history, why it is that the memoir has become so popular, to the extent that the bookshelves in airport bookstores are just full of memoirs. We buy memoirs about people we don't know, we never heard of, we don't actually care about. We're very much interested in reading about other people's lives. And there's a history here. Fiction actually began in the form of a memoir. The earliest novels had first-person narrators. They had that kind of autobiographical quality to them. But it's only in the late 20th century that we get this huge avalanche of actual memoirs written not just by famous people, the Eleanor Roosevelts and the Jimmy Carters of the world, but just mere mortals like the rest of us. And this is beginning to spill in even into academic writing. It used to be, we were taught to be strictly objective in academic writing, never use the first-person pronoun. And now even in scientific papers, you'll see references like, I did this, or we did this, or whatever. It's kind of become part of how you write scientific papers even these days. These memoirs are interesting because, as Bernard Cooper points out, what you're seeing is kind of a performative aspect of selfhood. When you write a memoir, publish a memoir, you put yourself on display in a way that you don't otherwise. And it's interesting just to note that, geez, everybody's doing it these days. It's quite interesting. Okay, so now let's get back to what it means to have an autobiographical memory. Well, the first way we can think about this, let's just kind of build up on this. You've got here an event, a hippie touched a debutante, and this is your basic propositional representation. You've got the subject, the hippie, the object, the debutante, the relationship between them, that he did some touching, and we've got some semantic information about hippies and debutantes and various kinds of touching and all that. And that's a propositional representation of an event like the hippie touched the debutante. But if you think about it for a second, it's not yet a memory. Okay, what else do you need for a memory? William James talked about this. Okay, you've got to have an image first of the original event, but a further condition is required because it has to stand for a past event. So the first necessary ingredient after a raw description of the event itself is it has to be located in time and space. So we can do that. Here's our hippie who touched the debutante in the park on Thursday, specifies it as a unique event that has a unique location in space and time. But even that doesn't make it an autobiographical memory. It's just a memory about some hippie and some debutante. And James noticed this as well. I must think that I directly experienced its occurrence. So it gives it that warmth and intimacy that comes with a personal memory. So what we really have to have is something like this. I saw a hippie touch a debutante in the park on Thursday. That reference to the self is what's essential for making something a truly autobiographical memory, a truly episodic memory, for that matter. So the first thing we have to have, if we're going to have an autobiographical memory, it seems obvious, but people didn't think of this for a long time, is you've got to have some kind of self-reference. So the first ingredient of an autobiographical memory is an episodic memory, a representation of some event that has a unique place in space and time. The second ingredient is some kind of self-reference, which can take a number of different forms. Linguistically, you can refer to yourself as the agent or the patient of some action, that is the person who did something, or the person that something was done to, or you can refer to yourself as the stimulus or experiencer of some state, that is a person who had some kind of feeling at a particular time, or the person who created that feeling in somebody else. I gave a present to Lucy, Lucy gave a present to me, I made Lucy happy, Lucy made me happy. I'm the agent or the patient, the stimulus or the experiencer of some event. And this self-reference is also going to include some information about my mental state at the time that the event occurred. I was appalled when I saw the hippie touch the debutante. I was amused when I saw the hippie touch the debutante. When I saw the hippie touch the debutante, I wanted to become a hippie. Whatever your mental state was, okay, that's going to be also represented as part of this memory. But even that's not enough, because it turns out these autobiographical memories do not exist in isolation from each other. They are at the very least organized into some kind of chronological sequence. As Shank and Abelson pointed out, memories are organized as stories. At least autobiographical memories are organized as stories. And stories have to have a particular kind of structure to them. All stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Okay? So it's not just that a hippie touched a debutante in the park on Thursday. We want to know what led up to the hippie touching the debutante, and we want to know what happened afterwards. All of that becomes part of our autobiographical memory. Now, there's been a lot of attention paid to the chronological organization of these autobiographical memories, and we're going to talk about that a little bit about that today. But let me just first point out that there are two aspects to this chronological organization or temporal organization that we have to talk about. First is what you might think of as what's internal to the event itself. Okay, a hippie touched a debutante, but by marking out that event as separate from other events, even that little event has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Did he do it tentatively? Did he do it in a hostile manner? Was it kind of rapid lead up or whatever? And then there are these external relations to other events. What led up? What happened before the hippie touched the debutante? What happened after? And one of the interesting things about social cognition is looking at how people actually divide up the events that they experience in their life. Think about going home today and your roommate says, "What'd you do today?" Well, you could start by, "Well, I got up, I made some coffee, I had breakfast, I did this, I did that, the other thing." Or you could say, "I went to school and I came home." Right? One is a big event, right? You're encompassing a whole bunch of stuff in one big chunk. Another format is that you've divided the day up into a lot of smaller chunks. How you do that is part of the organization of memory. So now, how do we organize memories temporally? A lot of work has been done by a British psychologist named Michael Conway, who's probably the leading investigator of autobiographical memory today. And he argues that when we recall events of our own lives, which is what autobiographical memory is, we do so with respect to an organization of our lives so far into what he calls lifetime periods, big chunks of our lives that somehow hang together. And that, in the first place, our autobiographical memory consists of a whole bunch of general knowledge about distinct periods of time. So if you think about your own memories of high school, for example, you might have distinct memories for each of the 4 years of high school, or high school might just be one kind of blur for you now. But you know that there are certain things that happen. There's a junior prom and a senior prom, and there's the homecoming game, and all these kinds of things that are part of that epic in time. And then we've got in autobiographical general events that are repeated more or less in the same way over time. You go home for Thanksgiving dinner this year. You're going home for Thanksgiving dinner last year. You're going to go home for Thanksgiving dinner next year. And then there are specific events that occur that are more or less unique, not repeated over time. So what Conway calls the autobiographical knowledge base consists first of these three quite different things. First, a blocking of one's lifetime into particular periods that hang together somehow. Second, knowledge about general events that are repeated in more or less the same way. You can think of that as kind of on the edge between episodic and semantic memory. And then you've got event-specific knowledge, truly episodic knowledge about what goes on. So now let's take a look at how we find specific memories. Oh, here's his the depiction of this autobiographical knowledge base. You've got these lifetime periods, time when you had, and themes that are exemplified by them. So there might be relationship themes, your first boyfriend, living with somebody, being married to somebody. Those are different periods in your life. Or if your memories emphasize work themes, your first job, working at a particular job, and then having a different job. And then there are these general events, okay, and then these very specific events down here. That's the general organization of what Conway calls the autobiographical memory knowledge base. Okay, so let me skip over this for a second. Conway points out that autobiographical memories, we get autobiographical memories in two different ways, one of which is by means of what he calls direct retrieval. I ask you if you did something ever, you reach back into memory and you pull out a memory of that particular kind of event. Or what he calls, more interestingly, kind of generative retrieval, where you have to do a whole lot more work to construct the memory online, or rather reconstruct the memory online. So we got two different kinds of autobiographical memories here, those that we remember directly through direct retrieval, and those that we kind of construct in response to questions that people have asked us. All right. Now, this is the general pattern for autobiographical memory. What Conway and his colleagues did was to sit people down and ask them to write out everything they could remember from their lives, which is something that psychologists do to subjects about every 5 or 10 years. Somebody repeats this study. They always get the same results. You get a pattern that looks like this. Most people don't have too many memories from the first 3, 4, 5 years of life. Then memory starts growing. You got the most memories from the most recent periods of life, and this tapers off in a time-dependent fashion, which you can just think of as forgetting. Here you've got childhood amnesia, this lack of memories. A lot of things happen to you your first 5 years of your life, but you don't remember very much of it. Very interestingly, you've got this what's called a reminiscence bump. Notice that memory increases here into the teens and the 20s, and then drops off. People don't have too many memories for their late 20s, their 30s, early 40s, and then it picks up again. This reminiscence bump has been one of the most interesting phenomena that's very poorly understood, the characteristics of autobiographical memory, but you see it all the time. You especially see it in memories of elderly people who will often have a period where they don't remember too much from the 50s and the 60s and the 40s, but they have a whole bunch of memories from their 20s and 30s. Very, very, very characteristic. Okay, so we've got this general feature, set of features of lifespan memory. First, there's a recency effect, and everybody understands how that occurs. It's just a product of ordinary forgetting. Then you've got infantile and childhood amnesia.